Good afternoon. I'm glad to introduce you, Professor Joe McBride. I'm glad also to welcome all of the attendants, the ones that are in the classroom and everybody attending online. Professor McBride is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, where he teaches both at the School of Natural Resources and at the College of Environmental Design. Professor McBride's current research involves projects on the effects of urban forests in the reduction of air pollution, the composition, structure, and function of urban forests, the role of fire in riparian woodlands, and wind patterns, microclimates, and wind throw hazard in urban areas. So I can hardly think of a more fitting professor for the class on urban forestry that we start today. And that brings to an end the program of the Master degree in Biodiversity, Landscapes, and Sustainable Management of the University of Navarra. Today's class will introduce to us several natural aspects, aspects of the urban environment. And so, Joe, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for that introduction. I'd like to talk about natural factors in urban landscapes and review those natural factors that we will be addressing throughout the remainder of the course. And in that review, I want to tell you about an approach to analyzing these factors that was developed by a man named Ian McHarg, a professor of landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. Then I'd also like to talk a little bit about the urban ecosystem and the way in which humans have impacted ecosystem processes in urban areas. This is Ian McHarg, and this is a diagram of what he referred to as a layer cake of natural factors. And he felt that we need to look at natural factors, whether we're in urban areas or whether we're in non-urban areas, from the standpoint of this arrangement of factors. At the bottom of his layer cake, you will find geology, and he felt that was fundamental to the characteristics of any ecosystem, the geology from which the soil is formed, the geology that plays a role in the creation of the topography and the soil is extremely important to the characteristics of ecosystems that developed. So in terms of the urban environment, we find in cities like New York City some variation in the underlying geology. Most of the rock beneath Manhattan is of metamorphic origin, but its strength has determined very much the positioning of very tall buildings on the island of Manhattan. And there are other examples that we will explore when we discuss geology of the importance of geology in urban planning. And of course, geology has a very important dimension in controlling both plant and animal species that will live in any particular region. And we'll see examples of that when we talk about nature in the city. The next layer in McHarg's layer cake is topography, or physiography, as he calls it. That refers to the elevation of the land and the shape of the land surface. This is a map of the San Francisco Peninsula, and its topography is dominated by sort of a central ridge that you see in the three-dimensional model, and a series of higher elevations toward the north end of the city. Most of the eastern side of the city is relatively low elevation, relatively flat, because that is land that has been reclaimed from the bay by filling, but the hillier area forms a central portion of this city. And of course, that topography has affected, if you will, the characteristics of buildings and where buildings might be built. Excuse me, I have an incorrect slide there. We should correct that to show that in San Francisco we do build buildings on rather steep slopes that might in the present day be restricted because of slope limits. But in the past, they paid little attention to topography that we're paying more attention to in cities today. Soils is the next layer in this layer cake, and soils vary considerably within an urban area. We have mixtures of naturally occurring soils, and we have soils that have been affected by human activity. the undergrounding of utilities, the covering of former settlements often changes the soil from its natural pattern. And in the recent decade in cities in Europe and the United States, we've seen significant problems in what is called soil sealing, the covering of soil surfaces by impervious concrete or asphalt or buildings. That, of course, eliminates that soil from the natural processes that would allow it to support vegetation and wildlife. Next up in this ladder is hydrology. And hydrology, of course, refers to the movement of water at or near the surface of the ground. The hydrologic cycle is a very important cycle to look at in terms of the urban environment. We have rivers in many of our urban areas, and the flood potential of those rivers has resulted in various types of protective levees or walls that have been built to contain the rivers. We also have modified surface hydrology by the burial of streams into storm sewer systems. These red lines for the city of Philadelphia represent undergrounded streams that once flowed into the Delaware River that are all now modified into storm sewer systems, and they have been covered once they have been put into pipes by streets or in some cases by buildings, excluding them from potentials for urban nature. There is a movement afoot to daylight streams to see if we can bring them back from their burial in earlier times to afford places for both plants and animals to dwell within our cities. Climate, of course, is broken down into macro and microclimate. We have regional macroclimates that our cities don't have too much impact on, but local microclimates are certainly affected by the characteristic of cities. This diagram, the red line, represents temperature, and this higher temperature that is shown over the center of the city represents what is called the heat island effect. The central parts of cities, because of the impervious surface, because of the concentration of automobiles or the heating of buildings, are areas that are much warmer than the adjacent suburban communities or adjacent areas of the natural landscape, so that cities become uncomfortable sometimes in the summertime because of this urban heat island. These two individuals are trying to seek some comfort in an afternoon that was 125 degrees Fahrenheit, and I was told in Dubai if they could figure out a way to sell shade, they certainly would make a lot of money. But it is a factor of our modern environments that our cities have become less comfortable, and this of course has an effect on organisms that could live in different parts of the city. Vegetation is another factor in this set of urban factors that we will be looking at. This is an overview of a portion of the city of San Francisco, showing a park in the foreground, the canopy of trees in the park, and then trees aligning some streets as well as backyard gardens. Trees occupy a number of urban environments, and their presence creates habitats for a number of birds and mammals in some cases. Typical street trees in American cities, trees and lawns that occur in urban parks. There are often smaller streams that still possess a bit of the natural riparian vegetation, as is the case here in Pamplona, that provide very special habitats in terms of urban vegetation. And then finally, we will get to people. But before that, we should say a little bit about wildlife. Wildlife, of course, inhabits urban areas. Wild animals make use of trees. They sometimes make use of our structures in terms of places to nest, and their populations can be populations that become pests, or they can be populations that we get a great deal of enjoyment out of seeing. We have to also consider that there is domestic wildlife in the city. House cats have tremendous impacts in some cities in affecting bird populations. We have in some of our cities feral populations of parrots that have been released or escaped from captivity that are reproducing and forming important wildlife additions to the urban environment. Well, in terms of urban planning, I would like to just briefly relate how these factors are evaluated in the planning process. This is a sort of planning process diagram, and you'll see on the on your right a list of natural factors, topography, geology, etc. And in the planning process, there's a data collection phase in which information concerning these factors is gathered for the particular city or the particular site within a city, along with other characteristics such as the visual characteristics of the site or the social factors or the infrastructure, and also a review of laws and regulations that might be affecting the planning process. Those are then analyzed. Analysis is made of what is called the capability, sort of opportunities and constraints that these various natural factors impose upon the planning process, as are the other factors analyzed from the perspective of planning. And then the analysis of these factors is brought together in some sort of master plan that hopefully incorporates laws and regulations as well as the regional setting in addition to these factors. McHarg has suggested that his layer cake, he did not call it a layer cake, but it's certainly been called that by all of the rest of us, might be a way of looking at constraints and opportunities relative to these factors. And he proposed, before we had computers, that multiple acetate layers of maps could be proposed on a clear piece of acetate. You could draw a map that identified the constraints for a particular project based on geology or based upon tidal inundation or based upon forest values. And you would color those portions of the map with a solid black color if the constraints really limited the project. You might use a stippling if there was moderate amount of constraints associated with developing the project in that area. But if there were no constraints, then the acetate was clear. And as you stack these up, you could clearly see down to a base map where a project could be built with minimal impact. This is a map of an area of Philadelphia in which there was a proposal to build a freeway from this intersection here down to this intersection. And McHarg was employed to identify the best route for that freeway that would minimize impacts and also would have a minimum amount of safety problems associated with it. And so he began preparing this map. This is an erosion potential map. The very black areas, because of their soil type or their steepness of slope, had a high potential for erosion. The white areas were basically left clear on the acetate because they were relatively level, had no erosion potential. And so similarly, in addition to that erosion potential map, he developed a map of the constraints associated with geology, constraints associated with putting a freeway through forested areas. In this case, the darker areas were the areas that had the highest value as forests, and those would be areas that we would not want the freeway to go through. Similarly, wildlife values, as you see. And then basically what you see on the left is a composite where you stack all of those maps together, and the clear areas are the areas in which there are no constraints, and so that provided two routes for the construction of this freeway that would have minimum constraints. Now, this antiquated method of drawing maps on acetate has been replaced by computer graphics with GIS applications. This is a map of fire hazard of the Berkeley Hills and the Oakland Hills near Berkeley, California. The red areas are the areas of highest fire hazard, highest fire danger. And this used McHarg's method in a computer rather than in the acetate method to analyze topography, natural vegetation, weather patterns to identify areas of highest fire danger. Let's talk now a little bit about urban ecosystems. All of these factors that I have listed interact in an ecosystem. And if we're thinking of just a ecosystem apart from an urban area, we talked this morning about some of the processes such as energy flow, mineral cycling, and information transfer that take place within ecosystems. And those are diagrammed here, as well as some hydrologic features and some features with the atmosphere in terms of gas exchange. The urban environment, of course, imposes human activity upon that system, and it may also reduce the number and amount of some of those natural components in terms of the producer organisms or the consumer organisms. We can modify biotic components, abiotic components, and we can impact these processes. This is a generalized diagram that's in your handout this afternoon that tries to point out how humans affect not only the sources of energy or water or gases, but also can have effect upon the biotic and components of systems as well. Basically, we have the potential to affect each of the components of an ecosystem. One of those components are the plants. We bring plants into the city based on our preference for particular plants, and so we can and have changed the plant biota of an urban area. This is a section of the city of Berkeley in which these traffic circles have recently been introduced with the introduction of quite a few flowering plants for the pleasure of the people who live nearby. But if we look at the municipal forests, the street trees within that particular city, the most common tree in this city is the London plane tree, not obviously a native tree from the local flora, but a cultivar, and it constitutes about something on the order of 9% of the tree population and about 22% of the tree canopy cover. If we look at a landscape on your left that is typical of the landscape that the city of Berkeley was built in, was a woodland, savanna, grassland landscape over which the city was laid with a removal of many, many trees and, of course, replacement and replanting with other species to give the aerial view of the city that you see on the left of your screen. And this illustrates the composition of that urban forest. As you can see, as we've talked about, 9% of the tree population is made up of London plane, and it has 22% cover. In the city, of course, as an exotic species, it's not present in the natural forest. If we go down the list to coast live oak, in the city of Berkeley, it constitutes about 5% of the tree population and about 3% of the canopy cover, whereas in the natural woodlands prior to the development of the city, it represented about 80% of the tree population in terms of numbers of trees and about 70% of the canopy cover. So humans have the potential and have demonstrated that potential time and time again in our cities to affect the urban forest, the canopy cover within the city. We also can have direct effects upon animals in the urban ecosystem. Until fairly recently, we thought we had extirpated the mountain lion from our cities in California, but the mountain lions have started coming back. We didn't attempt to replace that predator with the house cat, but the house cat has become the principal urban predator as a result. 2 years ago, this memorial sprang up in the city of Berkeley after a mountain lion was killed in the backyard of a home necessarily by the police. And the local community set up this little overnight memorial decrying the fact that the animal had to be shot, but also providing some information on this animal. Our cities also have a lot of exotic species that have been well adapted to urban conditions. Again, in California, the eastern fox squirrel was introduced for hunting purposes and has pretty much displaced the western gray squirrel because both squirrels are dependent upon nesting sites, and the more aggressive eastern fox squirrel basically has driven the gray squirrels out of the nesting sites, and so their population rates have, their fecundity rates have dropped significantly, and they're disappearing from our urban areas. The European starling was brought to North America in the 19th century and is very well adapted to urban situations and is a very common bird in our cities. Now, all sorts of modifications take place relative to the abiotic components of ecosystems. We have, of course, affected solar radiation through the amount of air pollution we release into the atmosphere that reduces the amount of solar energy that reaches the ground. We have also brought in other sources of energy that maybe don't fuel energy flow through plants and animals, but fuel our cities, and related with that incorporation of energy is some pollution problems. In terms of water, we in the more arid parts of the world irrigate lawns, irrigate parks within our cities to keep them green in the summertime, and that certainly changes the water balance for those particular cities. We have polluted natural streams in many of our cities, and we're making attempts in some parts of the world to create what are called vegetative swales to help clean up runoff water that is moving through the city. In terms of atmospheric gases, pollution has been a serious problem in the industrial age that we talked about this morning. We've reduced it to some degree, and the incorporation of trees into urban environments is a way in which air pollution can further be reduced in metropolitan areas. In terms of the minerals that are present, of course there was that natural geology of the landscape that a city was built on, but we often bring minerals up, and dust associated with those minerals, the production of those minerals in some areas have affected soil characteristics in our cities, as we will see in a few minutes. This is, again, our ecosystem diagram that we've looked at before to emphasize that humans can not only directly impact the species that are present, but also impact these ecosystem processes. And I'd like to talk particularly about two ecosystem processes and give some examples of how they have been modified by humans in urban areas. And the first of these is primary productivity. The scene on your left is of a non-urban ecosystem, and on your right, an urban ecosystem. The changes that have taken place are changes in biomass productivity. This is from a study by Larson and his associates, in where we have relatively similar overall primary productivity rates for the wildland forest and the urban forest, but rather significant differences in terms of the amount of biomass that's produced in the form of foliage in the natural forest compared to the urban forest. And that, to a large degree, has to do with the pruning of trees, the way that trees are managed in areas. We have a considerably larger contribution to overall biomass productivity in urban areas due to the use of grasses and herbs in gardens and in lawns in our cities that usually increases productivity over natural forests by a factor of 10 or more. In terms of grasslands versus lawns, there's a natural grassland here on your left and a lawn ecosystem on your right in Central California. A study was done in the suburbs of San Francisco, a city called Walnut Creek, in which Falk basically measured his inputs in maintaining a lawn for the course of a year. The net primary productivity of his lawn in a Mediterranean climate was about 5 times greater than the net primary productivity of the natural grassland, simply because he watered the lawn, he allowed the plants to grow to capture CO2 for an entire year, whereas the annual grasses by this time of year have dried up, and there will be no primary productivity until probably October or November. Energy flow in terms of the insects and primarily the earthworms that were eaten by birds was considerably higher in his lawn than in the grassland. He found that robins, in particular American robins, fed in flocks and flocked to his yard because of the watering, the fertilizer that he had added to his yard increased the biomass productivity of earthworms. The drying out of the soils in the natural landscape adjacent to this community resulted in very small populations of earthworms, and so there was less transfer. There was a significant loss of nutrients from his lawn ecosystem simply because when he mowed the lawn, he collected the clippings in a bag attached to his lawnmower, and these were dumped, put in the garbage. And so that interfered with the return of those clippings to the ground surface, the decay of those clippings, and the cycling of minerals. This, of course, didn't happen in the natural grassland. And then he calculated his energy input in terms of maintaining this lawn, and this was mostly gasoline to run his gasoline-powered lawnmower. And that was about 1,800 kilocalories per square meter per year compared to 0 for the natural grassland. And then the input of irrigation water in liters to keep this lawn irrigated was over 300,000 liters of water a year that was applied. So he maintained a very pleasant looking lawn, a lawn that had recreational value for his children, but at a very high cost of energy and of water in this particular system. Now let me turn your attention to mineral cycling as a second process in an urban ecosystem. And I want to talk about a study that was done by a man named McDonald and his associate Pickett in the area around New York City. They established what they called an urban to rural gradient from Manhattan out into rural Connecticut, along which to study ecosystem processes. And ground zero, if you will, on that transect was Manhattan. And Manhattan, of course, is characterized by lots of impervious surface, lots of factors that would contribute to an urban heat island. At the other end of the gradient was an oak forest in a county park in rural Connecticut. He selected upland sites along this gradient that were well-drained sites that would be similar in terms of their geology. They were all sites primarily on schist outcrops or on schists. And the variation in forest cover from NYC, which represents New York City, out to LCC, which is Litchfield County, at the rural end of the gradient, of course, forest cover, any dimension of forest was very low in New York City, and that increased. And this is just an imaginary line. It may have been a straight line. It may have jumped up stair-step wise. Similarly, if he looked at urban variables like population, like traffic, like buildings, very high in New York City, very low in this rural county park. Air quality in terms of particulates were very high in New York City. Quality in terms of relative amounts of ozone and the oxides of nitrogen those concentrations resulted to poor air quality in New York City and higher air quality out. This is an example of the forests in Litchfield, Connecticut. In terms of the soils beneath those forests, leaf litter concentrations were high. The amount of heavy metals in those soils was quite low, whereas heavy metals were part of the pollution problem in New York City. He found that fungal populations within the parks in New York City were very low. Fungus is pretty sensitive to heavy metals in the soil, and they concluded that might be one reason why there were lower populations of fungal species. But they found that earthworm populations were much higher in New York City than they were in this rural area. The Wisconsin glaciation that occurred in North America about 10,000 years ago basically scraped away most of the shallow soils on these schist outcrops on these upland sites. and with those soils that were scraped away were the earthworms that were present. So as soil formation took place in subsequent times, the earthworms have not migrated back into these soils. But in New York City, people fished in the rivers around the city, and they often fished with earthworms, and when they were through fishing, they were kind enough to pour their earthworms on the ground rather than drown them in the streams, and so the earthworm population of the city of New York is quite high in city parks. And we'll see that's a very important key to understanding the effect of urbanization on a couple of processes, one of which is the carbon cycle within the city. And this is a generalized illustration of a carbon cycle. I won't go through the details of this, but basically we're talking about photosynthesis capturing CO2 and producing then CO2-based compounds, carbohydrates, and then those flowing through the food chain or through detritus to the soil with a breakdown and possible return to the atmosphere. And that's augmented, of course, by the burning of fossil fuels. They looked at the cycle of decay of carbon in their forests, both at a series of parks between New York City, including parks in New York City and rural Connecticut. And they simplified, if you will, that carbon cycle to one of basically photosynthesis producing a leaf biomass that drops to the ground in these deciduous forests, and then the decomposers decomposing that material and returning CO2 to the atmosphere. And they use leaf litter bags that would have prevented insects from being part of this breakdown process. The process of breakdown would have to be accomplished, if you will, by fungal species. And they did sort of a reciprocal experiment where they took leaf litter from New York City, put it in bags, and put it at the interface between the organic matter and the A horizon in New York City. And they took also New York City litter and placed it in bags and put it in Litchfield, Connecticut, and vice versa. They brought litter from Litchfield back into New York City to see how it decomposed. Now, to understand how this process takes place, I have to remind you about the different types of carbon that you would find in plant material or any organic material. There's readily mineralizable carbon that's going to break down in a matter of days. And then there is a labile carbon that might take a few weeks to a few months to break down. And then potentially mineralizable carbon that will take months to years, and then very passive carbon that will take years to decades. And to remind you of these different types of carbon, I'd like to demonstrate what every kid in Berkeley, California does when you give him an Oreo. And he does that because he knows about readily mineralizable carbon. You can't fool kids when you give them these cookies. Now, basically, I have here, pardon my awkwardness, an Oreo cookie. And as I said, if you give this to a kid, he immediately twists it apart. Look at that. That white stuff is readily mineralizable carbon. Now, when he's taking care of the readily mineralizable carbon, he goes for the labile carbon, but not quite as sweet. Now this box, this plastic box, really is carbon too, but it's passive carbon. So he doesn't eat any of that. The cardboard is also carbon. It's potentially mineralizable carbon. He doesn't eat any of that. But if you put the box in the ground, you put the plastic holder in the ground, this would decay in time. This would take a very, very long time for that carbon. So if you would distribute these, I'd like everyone to have a chance to have some readily mineralizable carbon. Okay, with that background, what they found in terms of the carbon pool in the litter was in the urban areas, readily mineralizable carbon concentration of the leaves was relatively low. In leaves that are exposed to ozone, they tend to build up a lot of parenchyma tissue. Parenchyma is that tissue that when you pull those strings out of a piece of celery, allow those strings to stick together, and it's a supportive tissue, and parenchyma built up in the leaves, and because of its particular structure, it's not a material that's readily mineralizable. In the absence of air pollution in rural Connecticut, the amount of readily mineralizable carbon was quite high in the leaves. In terms of labile carbon, it was low in the urban areas. Potentially mineralizable carbon was low in the urban areas, but passive carbon was very high in those leaves. And the reverse, if you will, was true for the rural areas. And so it's relatively easy for the fungus to decompose the leaves in terms of their readily mineralizable carbon, but for these passive carbons it took a bit longer. The litter rates from both sources of leaves, the decomposition rate of the litter was higher in the urban areas, and that was primarily because the soils were warmer due to the urban heat highland effect. But urban soils developed over time, and at the time this study was done, higher concentrations of passive carbon because of the effect of air pollution on the tissues in the plant leaves. Basically, they concluded that urban soils would store more carbon over long periods of time, and there was lower levels of readily digestible and labile carbon in urban soils that could resist lower rates of microbial action. So basically, the simplified carbon cycle suggested that there was some decrease in the composition in urban forests as opposed to rural forests. Now, the other cycle that they looked at in their study was the nitrogen cycle that, again, is simplified here. They further simplified it to basically look at nitrogen in plants. Plants drop their litter to the ground, and there's a process of mineralization in which the proteins, the amino acids, are broken down to release ammonium, and then ammonium goes through a set of processes involving bacteria that are referred to as nitrification, that converts ammonium to nitrate, and then nitrates can be absorbed by the plants to complete the cycle. So again, their study used litter decomposition bags. They placed these litter decomposition bags at the contact between the O and A horizons in the soil, as well as in the A horizons. And basically what they found was that in mineral areas, in urban areas, the rate of mineralization, basically from litter to ammonia, was low, but the rate of nitrification was high, and the reverse was true in the rural areas. Okay, I'm running on reserve. All right. Let me see if we can finish this up pretty fast. Basically, the situation in New York City, the urban soils, slowed down this mineralization process, whereas nitrification went pretty well. The reverse was true. And their conclusions were that earthworms were playing a very important role here. Earthworms do two things. One is they bring leaves down from the surface of soil into the ground, and they consume that leaf material, but they're not very efficient consumers in that they pass a lot of leaf material through their digestive system back into the soil. Now, that material is broken down, so its surface to volume ratio is much lower than the original leaf litter, and this facilitates then bacterial and fungal action in further breaking this material down. The other thing that the earthworms do is that they produce a material that is called mucoprotein, the sort of slime that allows them to move through the soil. and not be stuck in the soil. And that has a fair amount of nitrogen in it, so their presence in the soil increases the carbon, it lowers the carbon to nitrogen cycle in the soil, and that makes it somewhat easier for other organisms in the soil to operate. Let me have another demonstration, since we're working with things that children like. And this is a particular Hershey bar that maybe you're familiar with. Your little brothers and sisters probably can immediately open it up and say, yes, that does look like mucoprotein. There are those little fragments of the leaves that the earthworms have chopped up for us, and then all that white stuff is just mucoprotein with plenty of nitrogen there. That makes that quite attractive and relatively of interest to the other organisms that will finish the job. So please enjoy some mucoprotein. Now, they interpreted these results in that they felt that mineralization is slow in New York City because of this larger concentration of passive carbon in the leaf litter, but that nitrification is relatively rapid in New York City soils because of the carbon-nitrogen ratio. And the reverse was sort of true in the rural areas. A more rapid mineralization took place because of the characteristics of the leaves themselves, but the nitrification process was slowed down because of the absence of the earthworms that were contributing both to the breakdown in size as well as providing mucoprotein. So they concluded that earthworms played a major role in the urban forest ecosystem. Of course, that will vary from place to place. This may be a unique situation where the rural soils are without earthworms. That carbon sequestering is greater in urban soils because of the passive carbon that's present there. And over long periods of time, the increasing levels of passive carbon will have an effect in lowering the rates of microbial action in the urban forest. This will result in decreased litter decomposition, decreasing nitrogen cycling, increasing carbon to nitrogen ratio, and in the long term, decreased tree nutrition. So I think this is a very interesting study in that it has documented these processes along a rural to urban gradient, and hopefully gets us thinking about the complications of urban areas in terms of how they affect ecosystem processes. So I'd be happy to respond to any questions if we have any questions from you. I think everyone's consuming mucoprotein at this point. Well, for those of you who are going to be with me tomorrow, we're going to be talking about geology as a factor in the urban environment. So I hope that your childhood maps are coming along. Your childhood memories are beginning to bubble up. I see we have a question.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Professor. I have a question for you. From your experience, your own experience, what extent has this approach to cities as ecosystem permeated the decision-making levels too? Is there a perception from the people that make the decisions in cities that cities are itself ecosystems? Are they managing these places as ecosystems? Or on the other hand, do you think that, I mean, there's no consideration of cities as ecosystems or habitats that need to be preserved and need to be not degraded? What can you tell us about this?
Well, there's considerable variation, as you would imagine, around the world, with some very good examples from some parts of the world. I think the the initial thing that city planners have been looking at or started to look at is the role of the urban forest in ameliorating climate situations, making the reducing the urban heat island, making the city a more comfortable place. So we see a lot of thought being devoted to how to design an urban forest to deal with this unfavorable heat that occurs in the summertime. Beyond that, there has been some work done on looking at the role that trees play in urban areas in reducing air pollution. And again, that's not a lot of cities have done that, but I think just the general idea that if we increase tree canopy cover, we will have an effect on air pollution. And so you see a number of cities throughout the world increasing tree canopy cover with that as a primary objective. More recently, I think through the influence of the field of landscape ecology, we've recognized the importance of corridors for many wildlife species and city park systems, and particularly areas with urban creeks have been the focus in some cities of trying to establish corridors that will allow for the movement of wildlife populations into and across our cities. And cities like St. Louis, cities like Portland, Oregon, in the United States have really been at the forefront of sort of converting the riparian areas in their cities into forest-covered conduits for wildlife within the city. I have, seen some examples of the protection of nature in cities where we have rare and endangered species by changing the use of city parks to making them serve more as nature preserves as opposed to serving as recreational facilities. So I think there are sort of movements on many fronts in this direction, but a lot more still needs to be done.
Good afternoon. In the last years, several factories are promoting the plantation of trees in natural areas in order to compensate the CO2 emissions. Mm-hmm. Do you think that this initiative should be developed in urban areas? Because the question of carbon is more important.
Yeah, a number of studies have been done by the U.S. Forest Service to identify the potential that trees might have in urban areas for carbon sequestration and also for managing trees simply for carbon storage in urban areas. And so these studies have suggested that we could probably sequester on a per hectare basis about 1/3 of the amount of carbon in an urban area that we could sequester in a forest. And that's primarily due to the amount of space that is available for planting. But some very interesting architectural innovations have taken place through the use of green walls and green roofs on buildings. Some of this was initiated primarily to reduce air conditioning costs in these buildings, have been very successful in that way. But they're also being looked at issues of carbon sequestration as well. So I think that we've kind of moved beyond tree planting as a way of approaching this to looking at other ways of getting more photosynthetic surface into our cities by planting walls or planting on the roofs of buildings.
Hi. I was a little bit surprised by a couple of figures that you gave on the productivity of trees on urban forests and wildlands. I saw that the productivity in wildlands was slightly higher than the productivity for trees in urban forests. The wildlands had a productivity of more than 100 grams per square meter per year, whereas the urban forests was 700 and something. Mm-hmm. I should have actually expected it to be the other way around. I mean, a higher productivity in the urban environment because you have a better choice of selecting more productive species, I think. So this lower productivity in urban forests, assuming it's net productivity, of course, could it be related to this higher sequestration of carbon in soil in urban environments, or is more related to the selection of species?
I think it's related in part to the selection of species, but I think it's also related in part to the management of species in urban areas. There is extensive pruning that's being done, typically in a city where you may have overhead power lines. You're restricting the height of the trees to keep them from growing into the power lines. In the city that I live in, typically eastern red oak, which is a very popular species to plant there, is never allowed to get taller than about 35 feet. Whereas in the natural forest, it will grow to a height of 70 to 80 feet. So there is a reduction in the crown canopy of trees in urban areas that I think is contributing in part to that reduction. I think that we could increase that primary productivity of our urban forests by selection of different tree species that are often being used that could, even though they might be of shorter stature because of larger leaf surface area, capture more carbon dioxide.
So on the last question, I think I'm going to be the one doing it. I would say that we in Spain found somehow difficult to think of the trees in a city like as a whole, you know, to the very concept of urban ecosystem or urban forest for us. I would say that it's difficult to grasp. So could you think of some improvements that would bring to planners to have in their minds the whole of the trees in a town considered as a whole and not just as, you know, a set of different spots where they should take care of some trees that are there?
Well, I think that, you know, sort of the dilemma we face is that most of these planners have come up through the planning profession, landscape architecture, for example, in which the aesthetics were the focal point of plant materials to be used in the city without much consideration for the ecological values. And I think that paradigm is shifting now in terms of how people are being trained in our landscape architecture departments in the United States, in our planning departments. And the focus on sustainability often has opened an opportunity for how we select and use plant materials in cities that I think will point us in a better direction in the future.
So, thank you, Joe, for your presentation, and I see that our students will have a great learning time these coming days that we hope that you enjoy in Pamplona. Thank you very much.
Let's hope we don't have to do this again.